They said I had the face of a horse, and for 22 years I believed them. But the night Lord Edmund Blackwood dropped his crystal glass at the sight of me, I understood that the world had been wrong about beauty all along. I was born in the stables of Thornfield Manor on a night when the autumn wind howled through the cracks in the wooden walls and my mother bled her life away on a bed of straw. My father, Thomas Whitmore, was the head groom, a man whose hands knew the language of horses better than they ever knew the language of his own grief. He wrapped me in his coat that night and carried me to the kitchen door, where the cook took pity on a motherless creature and warmed milk for me by the fire. That was the beginning of my life, cradled between the world of servants and the world of beasts, belonging fully to neither. My mother had been a seamstress before she married my father, a woman of delicate fingers and quiet dreams. I never knew her face except through the faded portrait my father kept in his small room above the stables, a miniature painting no larger than my palm. She had been beautiful, they said, with soft features and a gentle mouth. I inherited nothing of her softness. My face grew long and angular, my jaw squared like my father's, my eyes too large and dark beneath heavy brows. By the time I was 10 years old, the other children in the servants' quarters had given me my name, Horseface, Clara the mare. Go back to the stables where you belong. Children are cruel in the way that storms are cruel, without malice but without mercy either. I learned to keep my head down, to make myself small, to move through the corridors of Thornfield Manor like a shadow that no one wished to see. My father taught me to read in secret, borrowing books from the manor's library when the family was away. And in those stolen pages, I found worlds where a woman's worth was not measured by the slope of her nose or the curve of her cheek. I read of queens and warriors, of women who commanded armies and changed the course of history. But when I closed the books and returned to my work scrubbing floors and emptying chamber pots, I understood that those stories were not meant for someone like me. Thornfield Manor was a world unto itself, a great house of grey stone and climbing ivy that had stood for 300 years on the edge of the Yorkshire moors. The Blackwood family had ruled these lands since the time of the Tudors, their names synonymous with power, wealth, and the kind of cold aristocratic beauty that poets wrote sonnets about. I knew them only from a distance in my early years, glimpses of silk and velvet passing through corridors, the sound of laughter drifting from the drawing room like music from another world. The old Duke had been a stern man, but not unkind, and his Duchess had once stopped to admire my father's work with a new foal, her gloved hand resting briefly on my head as she passed. I was perhaps 7 years old, and I remember thinking that she smelled of roses and something else, something expensive and foreign that I could not name. They died within a year of each other, the Duke and Duchess, taken by the same fever that swept through the county in the winter of my 15th year. Their son inherited everything. Lord Edmund Blackwood, the new Duke of Thornfield, was 27 years old when he took his place as master of the manor, and from the very first day I sensed that something cold had settled over the house. I did not know then what I would later learn, that Edmund had been sent away to boarding school at the age of 8, and had spent most of his youth in London, far from the moors and the family that seemed to have no use for him. I did not know that his marriage 2 years before his parents' death had been arranged by his father to secure a trading alliance with a merchant family, or that his young wife had found him so cold and distant that she had taken to her bed with melancholy and never risen again. I knew only that the new Duke rarely smiled, that his eyes were the color of winter storms, and that the servants whispered about his temper in the quiet hours of the night. I was careful to avoid him. My work kept me in the lower parts of the house, the scullery and the laundry and the long dark corridors where the family never ventured. I scrubbed and polished and carried and cleaned, and I told myself that invisibility was a kind of freedom. If no one saw me, no one could hurt me. If I kept my head down and my mouth closed, I could survive another day, another year, another lifetime of being nothing to anyone. But fate, I would learn, has little patience for those who try to hide from it. It was the spring of my 22nd year when everything changed. The morning had begun like any other, with the gray light of dawn creeping through the narrow windows of the servants' quarters and the sound of Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, calling us to our duties. I dressed quickly in my plain brown dress and white apron, pinned my dark hair beneath my cap, and made my way to the east wing, where I had been assigned to clean the guest chambers in preparation for the house party that was to begin that week. Lady Rosalind, Edmund's younger sister, was to be engaged to the Earl of Westbrook, and the celebration would bring dozens of guests to Thornfield Manor. The house had been in a frenzy of activity for weeks. Every room polished until it gleamed, every linen pressed until it was crisp as paper. I had worked until my hands were raw and my back ached, but I did not complain. Complaint was a luxury that servants could not afford. I was kneeling on the floor of the blue guest chamber, scrubbing at a stain near the fireplace, when I heard the footsteps in the corridor. Heavy, purposeful, the stride of a man who owned every inch of the ground beneath his feet. I kept my head down, my brush moving in steady circles, hoping that whoever it was would pass by without notice. The footsteps stopped. I felt his presence before I saw him, a weight in the doorway, a shadow falling across the carpet where I knelt. I looked up slowly, and there he was, Lord Edmund Blackwood, the Duke of Thornfield, standing not 10 feet away with a look of such contempt on his face that I felt my stomach turn to ice. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell across his forehead, and those storm-gray eyes that seemed to see through everything and find it wanting. He was dressed for riding, his boots still muddy from the fields, and there was a riding crop in his hand that he tapped against his thigh with impatient rhythm. "What are you doing in here?" he demanded, his voice as cold as his eyes. I rose to my feet, my knees trembling beneath my skirts. "Cleaning, Your Grace," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "Mrs. Pemberton sent me to prepare the guest chambers." He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I watched his lip curl with something that might have been amusement if it had not been so cruel. "Good God," he said, and there was a laugh in his voice that cut deeper than any blade. "They sent the horse-faced girl to clean the chambers where my guests will sleep. What message do they think that sends?" I felt the blood drain from my face. I had heard the whispers all my life, had grown a thick skin against the casual cruelty of children and servants alike. But there was something different about hearing those words from the mouth of a duke, from a man whose power over my life was absolute. I wanted to disappear into the floor, to melt into the shadows and never be seen again. Behind him, I saw movement. 2 gentlemen had appeared in the corridor, guests who had arrived early for the festivities. They wore the fine clothes of London aristocracy, and they were watching the scene with the kind of idle curiosity that the wealthy reserve for the misfortunes of the poor. Edmund turned to them, gesturing toward me with his riding crop as though I were livestock at auction. "Gentlemen," he said, "allow me to present the finest specimen of Thornfield's serving staff. Note the elongated face, the prominent jaw. I believe her father breeds horses in our stables. Clearly the influence has spread." The gentleman laughed. It was a polite laugh, the kind that men of breeding use when they wish to please their host without committing themselves to an opinion. But to me, it sounded like thunder, like the crashing of a world that had already been so small and was now collapsing entirely. "Go back to the stables," Edmund said, turning away from me as though I had already ceased to exist. "Tell Mrs. Pemberton to send someone presentable. I will not have my guests greeted by a face that frightens children." I fled. There is no other word for it. I gathered my bucket and my brush, and I fled down the corridor, down the servants' stairs, through the kitchen where the cook called out to ask what was wrong, and out into the courtyard where I finally allowed myself to breathe. My lungs burned. My eyes burned. Everything in me burned with a shame so complete that I thought I might die of it right there on the cobblestones. My father found me in the stables an hour later, curled up in the corner of an empty stall with my face pressed against my knees. He did not ask what had happened. Perhaps he already knew, the way news travels through a great house, whispered from servant to servant like a disease. He simply sat down beside me in the straw and put his arm around my shoulders, and we stayed that way until the light began to fade and the horses grew restless for their evening feed. "You are beautiful, Clara," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "You have always been beautiful. Not in the way they understand, but in the way that matters. You have your mother's spirit." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that there was some measure of worth inside me that the world could not see, some hidden treasure that made up for the face that frightened children and amused dukes. But that night, lying in my narrow bed in the servants' quarters, I could not shake the sound of their laughter from my mind. I could not forget the look in Edmund's eyes, the casual cruelty with which he had stripped me of my dignity in front of strangers. I made a decision in the darkness of that night. I would survive this. I would survive him. I would bow my head and do my work and save every penny of my meager wages until I had enough to leave Thornfield Manor forever. I would find a position somewhere else, somewhere far from the moors and the Blackwoods and the memory of this humiliation. I would build a new life, and I would never again give anyone the power to make me feel so small. But the universe, I would discover, had other plans. The weeks leading up to the engagement ball passed in a blur of exhausted labor. I was reassigned to the laundry, far from the guest chambers and the eyes of the aristocracy, and I was grateful for the scalding water and the heavy irons that left no room for thought. I worked from dawn until well past dark, pressing linens and starching collars and trying not to think about the celebration that was building to a crescendo in the rooms above. Lady Rosalind, I heard, was radiant with happiness. She was 19 years old, golden-haired and delicate, the kind of beauty that inspired poetry and devotion. The Earl of Westbrook was said to be deeply in love with her, and even the servants spoke of the match with approval. It was a love match, they whispered, rare among the aristocracy. Lady Rosalind had chosen with her heart, and her brother, cold as he was, had not stood in her way. I had seen Lady Rosalind only a handful of times in my years at Thornfield Manor, but I remembered her kindness. She had once stopped me in the corridor and complimented the way I had arranged the flowers in the blue sitting room, a task that had not even been mine to do. She had a gentle way about her, a softness that seemed impossible in a house so full of hard edges. I hoped that her marriage would bring her happiness, that she would escape to a life of warmth and love, far from her brother's shadow. The night before the ball, Mrs. Pemberton summoned me to her office. I went with dread in my heart, certain that I was about to be dismissed, sent away from Thornfield Manor without reference or recourse. But when I entered the small room where the housekeeper kept her ledgers and her keys, I found her face lined not with anger, but with exhaustion. "We are short of hands for tomorrow night," she said, rubbing her temples as though the weight of the world pressed upon them. "3 of the serving girls have fallen ill, and I cannot find replacements on such short notice. I need you in the ballroom, Clara." I stared at her, certain I had misheard. "The ballroom," I repeated. "Me?" Mrs. Pemberton's eyes met mine, and I saw something in them that surprised me. It was not pity exactly, but something close to it. Something that acknowledged the cruelty I had suffered without being able to change it. "I know what happened," she said quietly. "I know what His Grace said to you, but I have no other choice. You will be stationed near the service entrance, keeping the refreshment trays filled. You will not be seen by the guests. I will make certain of it." "And if His Grace sees me?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Pemberton's jaw tightened. "Then we will deal with that as it comes. But I need you, Clara. Will you do this?" I should have said no. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to refuse, to stay hidden in the laundry where I was safe from Edmund's cold eyes and cruel words. But Mrs. Pemberton had always been kind to me, kinder than she needed to be, and I could see the desperation in her face. The ball was the most important event Thornfield Manor had hosted in years. The reputation of the house, of the family, rested on its success. "Yes," I said finally, "I will do it." She nodded, relief flooding her features. "Thank you, Clara." And she paused, her hand reaching out to rest briefly on my arm. "For what it is worth, I do not think you have a horse's face. I think you have a face full of character. There is a difference." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing. I returned to my work, to the endless piles of linen and the hiss of steam from the irons, and I tried not to think about what tomorrow would bring. The morning of the ball dawned gray and cold, with a mist rolling in from the moors that clung to the windows of Thornfield Manor like a living thing. I dressed in the plain black uniform that Mrs. Pemberton had provided, fastening the white apron around my waist and pinning my cap over my hair. I looked at myself in the small mirror above my washstand and saw what I always saw: a long face, a strong jaw, eyes that were too large and too dark, a face that frightened children. I turned away. The house was chaos. Servants rushed through the corridors with armloads of flowers and crates of champagne. The kitchen rang with the clatter of pots and the shouting of the cook, and somewhere above it all, Lady Rosalind could be heard laughing with pure joy. I kept to the shadows, helping where I was needed, counting the hours until the ball would begin, and I could take my place by the service entrance and pray to remain invisible. It was late afternoon when I encountered her. I was carrying a basket of fresh napkins through the servants' corridor when I nearly collided with a woman I did not recognize. She was middle-aged, with silver threading through her dark hair and a face that had once been beautiful and was now merely elegant. She wore the clothes of a lady, not a servant, but she was wandering through the lower halls as though she had lost her way. "Forgive me," she said, steadying herself against the wall. "I seem to have taken a wrong turn. I was looking for the garden entrance. I curtsied automatically. If you will allow me, my lady, I can show you the way." She smiled, and there was something warm in it, something genuine that I rarely saw in the faces of the aristocracy. That would be most kind. "I am Lady Ashworth," she added, as though I had asked. "My husband is the Baron of Ashworth. We are old friends of the Blackwood family." I nodded and began to lead her through the maze of corridors toward the garden door. She walked beside me in silence for a few moments, and I was acutely aware of her eyes on my face, studying me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "You are not like the other servants here," she said finally. "There is something different about you." I did not know how to respond, so I kept my eyes forward and my voice neutral. "I am just a maid, my lady. There is nothing different about me." Lady Ashworth laughed softly. "There is where you are wrong, my dear. I have spent 40 years in society, and I have learned to see what others miss. You carry yourself like a woman who has been wounded but has not broken. That is not nothing. That is a rare and precious thing." We had reached the garden door. I opened it for her, the cold mist rushing in to wrap around us both, and I gestured toward the path that led to the formal gardens. "The entrance is just through there, my lady. Shall I accompany you?" "No," she said, but she did not move. Instead, she reached out and took my chin in her hand, turning my face toward the gray light from the door. She studied me for a long moment, and I felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment. "What is your name?" she asked. "Clara, my lady. Clara Whitmore." "Clara," she repeated, as though tasting the word. "A beautiful name. It means bright. Did you know that? Clear and bright, like light through glass." She released my chin and stepped back, and there was something in her eyes that I could not read. "I have a feeling about you, Clara Whitmore. I have a feeling that before this night is over, a great many people are going to see what I see." She was gone before I could ask what she meant, disappearing into the mist of the garden like a figure from a dream. I closed the door behind her and stood for a moment in the dim corridor, my heart beating strangely in my chest. I did not know then that Lady Ashworth would change the course of my life. I did not know that our brief encounter was the first thread in a tapestry that would take months to weave. I knew only that something had shifted in the air, something that felt like the moment before a storm. The ball began at 8 o'clock. I took my place by the service entrance, hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain that separated the servants' passage from the glittering world of the ballroom. Through a gap in the fabric, I could see the chandeliers blazing with 1,000 candles, the polished marble floor reflecting the light like a frozen lake, and the guests in their silks and satins, their jewels and their powdered faces. Music floated through the air, a waltz played by an orchestra that I could not see, and everywhere there was laughter and color and movement. I watched Lady Rosalind make her entrance on the arm of the Earl of Westbrook, her golden hair piled high atop her head, and her white gown trailing behind her like a cloud. She was incandescent with happiness, her smile so bright that it seemed to illuminate the entire room. The Earl looked at her as though she were the only person in the world, and I felt something twist in my chest that might have been envy or might have been longing. I could not tell the difference. Edmund was there too, standing near the fireplace with a glass of champagne in his hand and his customary expression of bored contempt on his face. He was dressed in black evening clothes that made his pale skin seem even paler, and there was a woman on his arm, a dark-haired beauty with sharp features and a sharper smile. I would later learn that she was Lady Cordelia Vane, a widow of considerable fortune who had set her sights on becoming the next Duchess of Thornfield. But in that moment, she was simply another glittering figure in a room full of glittering figures, another reminder of the world that I would never belong to. The hours passed slowly. I moved through my duties like an automaton, refilling trays and clearing empty glasses, keeping to the shadows as Mrs. Pemberton had instructed. No one looked at me. No one saw me. I was as invisible as I had always been, and I told myself that this was what I wanted, that this was safer than being seen. It was nearly midnight when everything changed. I was returning from the kitchen with a fresh tray of champagne glasses, moving quickly through the servants' corridor toward the ballroom. The music had grown louder, the laughter more raucous, and I knew that the announcement of the engagement was imminent. I needed to be in position, needed to ensure that every guest had a glass raised when Lady Rosalind's betrothal was made official. But as I rounded the corner toward the service entrance, I found my path blocked. Lady Ashworth was standing there, and she was not alone. Beside her stood a young woman with soft brown hair and kind eyes, a woman I recognized as her daughter, Miss Catherine Ashworth. "There you are," Lady Ashworth said, as though she had been searching for me all evening. "I have been waiting for you, Clara." I stopped, confused. "My lady?" Lady Ashworth reached out and took the tray from my hands, passing it to her daughter as casually as though she were handing off a hat. "Catherine, take this to the ballroom. I need a moment with Miss Whitmore." Miss Catherine looked at me with curiosity, but did not argue. She took the tray and disappeared through the curtain, leaving me alone with Lady Ashworth in the dim corridor. I did not know what to say, did not know what was happening, and so I simply stood there waiting for an explanation that I could not imagine. "I have done something," Lady Ashworth said, and there was a gleam in her eyes that might have been mischief or might have been something deeper, something that you may thank me for or curse me for, depending on how the evening unfolds. But I want you to know that I did it because I believe in justice and because I cannot abide cruelty, even when it comes from the lips of a duke. She reached behind a stack of crates that stood against the wall and produced something that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a gown of deep midnight blue silk, with silver embroidery at the bodice and a skirt that fell in soft waves like water under moonlight. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. "Put it on," Lady Ashworth said. "There is a room just there where you can change, and take down your hair. Let them see you, Clara. Let them see what I saw this afternoon." I could not speak. I could not move. I stared at the gown in her hands and felt the world tilting beneath my feet, reality rearranging itself into a shape I did not recognize. "Why?" I finally managed to whisper. "Why would you do this?" Lady Ashworth's smile faded, and for a moment I saw something fierce and sad in her eyes. "Because I was you once," she said softly. "A long time ago, before I learned to wear my armor. Someone was kind to me when I needed it most, and I have never forgotten. Now go, Clara. The announcement will be made in 15 minutes, and I want you in that ballroom when it happens." I do not know what madness possessed me. I do not know why I took the gown from her hands and disappeared into the small storage room she had indicated. Perhaps it was the look in her eyes, the recognition of a pain she had once known. Perhaps it was the memory of Edmund's cruel words, still burning in my chest like an ember that would not die. Perhaps it was simply that I was tired, so deeply tired, of being invisible. I removed my plain black dress and my white apron. I let down my hair, the dark waves falling past my shoulders for the first time in years. And I put on the midnight blue gown, feeling the silk slide over my skin like a promise. There was a small mirror in the corner of the room, clouded with age, and I stood before it in the dim light and looked at myself. The woman who stared back at me was a stranger. She had the same long face, the same strong jaw, the same dark eyes that were too large for fashion. But there was something different about her, something that I could not quite name. She stood taller. She held her chin higher. She looked like someone who had stopped apologizing for existing. Lady Ashworth was waiting when I emerged. She took one look at me and nodded, satisfied. "Now," she said, "you will enter through the main doors of the ballroom, not the servants' entrance. The main doors." "My lady, I cannot." "You can," she said firmly, "and you will. This is not about pretending to be something you are not, Clara. This is about showing them something they have refused to see." She took my hands in hers and squeezed them gently. "When you walk through those doors, do not look at the floor. Do not hunch your shoulders. Do not try to disappear. Look straight ahead and remember who you are." "Who am I?" I asked, my voice trembling. Lady Ashworth smiled. "That, my dear, is what you are about to discover." She led me through the corridors of Thornfield Manor, through passages I had never walked before, upstairs I had never climbed. The music grew louder, the lights brighter, and with every step I felt my heart beating harder against my ribs. This was madness. This was impossible. I was a servant, a maid with a horse's face, and I was about to walk into a ballroom full of aristocrats, as though I belonged there. We reached the doors. They were massive carved oak, flanked by footmen in powdered wigs, who looked at me with confusion and something that might have been recognition. Lady Ashworth whispered something to them that I could not hear, and they exchanged glances before stepping aside. "Remember," Lady Ashworth said, her hand on my back. Bright and clear, like light through glass. The doors opened. The ballroom stretched before me like a dream, a sea of color and light and movement. The orchestra was playing a slow melody, something melancholy and beautiful, and the guests were gathered in clusters around the room, their faces turned toward the center where Lady Rosalind stood with her betrothed. The announcement had not yet been made. I had arrived just in time. I took a step forward, then another, and another. The sound of my footsteps on the marble floor seemed impossibly loud. I felt eyes turning toward me, conversations faltering, heads tilting with curiosity. Who was this woman in the midnight blue gown? Where had she come from? She was not a face they recognized, not a name they knew. I kept walking. I did not look at the floor. I did not hunch my shoulders. I looked straight ahead, just as Lady Ashworth had told me, and I walked into the center of that glittering world as though I had every right to be there. And then I saw him. Edmund was standing near the fireplace, a crystal glass of champagne in his hand. Lady Cordelia was beside him, her sharp smile fixed, and her eyes scanning the room with predatory interest. But Edmund was not looking at her. He was looking at me. I watched his face change. I watched the confusion give way to recognition, and then to something else, something that I had never seen in his eyes before. Shock, disbelief. And underneath it all, something that looked almost like wonder. The crystal glass slipped from his fingers. It fell slowly, or perhaps it only seemed that way, catching the light of the chandeliers as it tumbled through the air. When it hit the marble floor, it shattered with a sound that cut through the music like a blade. Every eye in the room turned toward the Duke of Thornfield. Every conversation stopped. And in the silence that followed, Edmund stared at me as though he were seeing a ghost, as though the world had shifted beneath his feet and he did not know how to find his balance. I did not look away. For the first time in my life, I did not look away. The moment stretched between us like a thread of silk, fragile and unbreakable. And then Lady Rosalind's voice cut through the silence, bright with curiosity and without a trace of malice. "Edmund," she said, "who is your friend? I do not believe we have been introduced." Edmund opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. I saw the struggle in his face, the war between pride and something else, something he did not know how to name. I decided to spare him the effort. "My name is Clara Whitmore," I said, and my voice rang clear through the ballroom, steadier than I had expected it to be. "I am the daughter of Thomas Whitmore, head groom of Thornfield Manor. And I am here because I was invited." The silence that followed was absolute. I could feel the shock rippling through the room, the scandal of a servant standing among them in silk and silver. I could feel Lady Cordelia's fury, Lady Rosalind's bewilderment, the curious whispers beginning to spread like fire through dry grass. And I could feel Edmund's eyes on my face, burning with an intensity that made my skin prickle. It was Lady Ashworth who broke the spell. She appeared at my side as though she had been there all along, her hand slipping through my arm with easy grace. "Miss Whitmore is my guest this evening," she announced to the room, her voice carrying the authority of 40 years in society. I found her in the servants' quarters and recognized in her a quality that is all too rare in our world. Dignity. True dignity. The kind that cannot be bought or inherited. She smiled at the assembled guests, daring them to challenge her. "I do hope you will all make her feel welcome." What followed was a blur of introductions, of hands extended and names exchanged, of smiles that ranged from genuine warmth to barely concealed hostility. I moved through it all in a daze, answering questions, accepting compliments, feeling as though I had stepped into someone else's life. Lady Ashworth remained at my side, steering me through the treacherous waters of aristocratic society with the skill of a seasoned captain. Her daughter Catherine took my other arm, whispering names and histories in my ear, helping me navigate a world I did not understand. And through it all, Edmund watched me. He did not approach. He did not speak. But his eyes followed me around the room, and every time I looked in his direction, I found him staring with that same expression of shock and wonder, as though he could not quite believe what he was seeing. The announcement of Lady Rosalind's engagement was made. Glasses were raised, toasts were offered, and the orchestra struck up a celebratory waltz. Guests began to pair off and move toward the dance floor, and I found myself standing near the edge of the room, watching the swirl of silk and satin, feeling suddenly and terribly alone. That was when he came to me. Edmund approached with the hesitant steps of a man walking on uncertain ground. Up close, I could see the lines of strain around his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides as though he did not know what to do with them. He stopped a few feet away, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. "Miss Whitmore," he said finally. And there was something strange in his voice, something I had never heard before. It took me a moment to recognize it as humility. "I owe you an apology." I raised my chin and met his eyes. "Do you?" His jaw tightened. "What I said to you, that day in the guest chamber. What I called you. It was unforgivable. Then perhaps I should not forgive you. He flinched as though I had struck him, and I felt a savage satisfaction that I was not proud of. But there was something else there too, something underneath the anger, a curiosity that I could not quite suppress. I had expected him to be dismissive, to wave away my transformation as a trick or a game. Instead, he was standing before me with his pride in tatters, struggling to find words that had never come easily to him. "You are right," he said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "You should not forgive me. I do not deserve it." He paused, his eyes searching my face as though looking for something he could not name. "But I need you to know that I see it now. What I was too blind to see before. You are not what I called you. You never were." "And what am I?" I asked, echoing the question I had asked Lady Ashworth. Edmund was silent for a long moment. Then he extended his hand toward me, palm up, an invitation. "May I have this dance?" "Miss Whitmore!" I should have refused. Every rational part of my mind screamed at me to refuse, to turn away from this man who had humiliated me, who had made me feel worthless and small. But there was something in his eyes, something broken and searching, that made me hesitate. And in that hesitation, I found myself placing my hand in his. The waltz swept us onto the dance floor. His hand settled at my waist, warm and steady, and I placed my other hand on his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him beneath the fine wool of his jacket. We moved together through the crowd of dancers, and I discovered with surprise that he was graceful, that his body knew the steps, even when his mind seemed to be elsewhere. "I cannot stop thinking about it," he said as we turned. "The way you looked at me when I said those words, the way your face changed. I have seen that look before." I did not respond. I focused on the music, on the movement of our bodies, on anything that would keep me from meeting his eyes. "My father had that look," Edmund continued, "when I was young, before they sent me away. He looked at me the way you looked at me that day, like I had disappointed him beyond all hope of redemption." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because I need you to understand." His voice was low, urgent, meant for my ears alone. "I need you to understand that I know what it is to be found wanting, to be told that you are not enough, that you never will be. My father made it clear from the time I could walk that I was a disappointment to him. Too quiet, too serious, too cold. He wanted an air with fire in his blood, and instead he got me. I looked at him then, truly looked at him, and I saw something I had never noticed before. Beneath the cold exterior, beneath the cruelty and the contempt, there was a wound that had never healed. A boy who had been sent away by parents who did not want him, who had built walls around his heart so high that he had forgotten there was anything inside them worth protecting. "That does not excuse what you did," I said. "No," he agreed, "it does not, but perhaps it explains it." He was quiet for a moment, leading me through a complex turn with effortless skill. I have spent my entire life hurting people before they could hurt me, pushing them away before they could see what I really am. I looked at you that day in the guest chamber, and I saw someone who reminded me of myself, someone who knew what it was to be judged and found lacking. And instead of recognizing that, instead of feeling compassion, I did to you what my father did to me. I made you feel small, because making others feel small is the only way I know how to feel powerful. The music was building toward its crescendo, the violins soaring, the candlelight flickering. We were moving faster now, swept up in the rhythm, and I felt something shifting inside me, something I was not prepared for. "I do not want your pity," I said. "I am not offering pity." He looked at me with those storm-gray eyes, and for the first time, I saw fire in them. "I am offering an apology, a real one. Not because I expect you to forgive me, but because you deserve to hear it. You are not what I called you, Clara Whitmore. You are something else entirely. And what is that?" The music stopped. We stood in the middle of the dance floor, still holding each other, surrounded by applauding guests who had no idea of the conversation that had just passed between us. Edmund's eyes never left my face. "I do not know yet," he said, "but I would very much like to find out." He released me then, stepping back with a small bow that might have been mocking in any other context but somehow felt genuine. I stood there, breathless and confused, watching him disappear into the crowd of guests. My heart was pounding, my head was spinning, and underneath it all, something dangerous was taking root, something that felt like hope. Lady Ashworth found me a few minutes later, her eyes sparkling with satisfaction. "Well," she said, taking my arm. "That was rather more dramatic than I expected." "What have you done?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What have you started?" She smiled, and there was wisdom in that smile and a touch of sadness. "I have done nothing, my dear. The fire was always there, waiting to be lit. I merely provided the spark. The rest of the evening passed in a haze. I spoke to more people than I could count, danced with gentlemen who seemed genuinely charmed by my company, and fielded questions about my background with the help of Lady Ashworth's careful coaching. I was not pretending to be something I was not. Everyone in that room knew I was a servant's daughter. But Lady Ashworth had somehow made that fact irrelevant, had somehow convinced them that a woman's worth could not be measured by the circumstances of her birth. It was nearly 3 a.m. when the last guests finally departed. I stood in the entrance hall, still wearing the midnight blue gown, watching the carriages roll away into the darkness. My feet ached, my head throbbed, and my heart was full of something I could not name. Lady Ashworth appeared beside me, wrapped in a traveling cloak. "We are leaving at first light," she said, "but I wanted to say goodbye before I go." I turned to face her, this strange woman who had changed my life in the space of a single evening. "Why?" I asked again, the question that had been burning in me all night. "Why did you do this? What did you hope to gain?" She was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the misty darkness of the moors. Then she said something that I would not understand for many months, something that would only become clear when the full story finally came to light. "Because I knew your mother," she said softly. "A long time ago, before you were born. She was my dearest friend, and I made her a promise that I was never able to keep. Until tonight." Before I could ask what she meant, she pressed something into my hand. It was a letter, yellowed with age, the seal broken but the paper still intact. "Read this," she said, "and when you have questions, as I know you will, come find me. I will tell you everything." She kissed my cheek, light as a moth's wing, and then she was gone, disappearing into the darkness with her daughter at her side. I stood in the entrance hall with the letter in my hand, feeling the weight of secrets I did not yet understand. The days that followed were strange and disorienting. I returned to my duties as a maid, scrubbing floors and washing linens as though the ball had never happened. But everything was different now. The other servants looked at me with a mixture of awe and suspicion, uncertain how to treat someone who had danced with dukes and dined with baronesses. Mrs. Pemberton said nothing about my transformation, but there was something in her eyes that might have been approval. And Edmund. Edmund was everywhere. He appeared in corridors where I was working, his presence so unexpected that I would drop whatever I was carrying and have to scramble to pick it up. He lingered in doorways, watching me with those storm-gray eyes, never speaking but always present. At first, I thought he was mocking me, waiting for me to make a mistake so he could remind me of my place. But there was no cruelty in his gaze, only a kind of bewildered fascination, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle that refused to make sense. A week after the ball, I finally read Lady Ashworth's letter. I had carried it with me everywhere, tucked into the pocket of my apron, feeling its weight against my hip like a talisman. But I had been afraid to open it, afraid of what secrets it might contain, what truths it might reveal about a mother I had never known. Finally, in the quiet darkness of my room, I lit a candle and unfolded the yellowed paper. The letter was dated 23 years ago, the year before I was born. It was written in a feminine hand, elegant but hurried, as though the writer had been pressed for time. "My dearest Catherine," it began, "I write to you in desperation, knowing that this letter may never reach you, that the miles between us may prove insurmountable. But I must try. I must tell someone the truth, even if I cannot tell the world. I have made a terrible mistake. You know that I was engaged to Lord Richard Blackwood before his family discovered my father's debts and broke the engagement. You know that I was cast out in disgrace, forced to find work as a seamstress to support myself and what remained of my family. But you do not know what happened after. Richard came to me. In secret. In the night, he came to me and swore that he loved me still, that he would find a way for us to be together. I believed him. God help me, I believed every word. And when he left me with child and married another woman 3 months later, I understood too late what kind of man he truly was. I am with child, Catherine, Richard's child, and I cannot keep it. Not because I do not want it, but because the scandal would destroy what little is left of my family. My mother would not survive the shame. My sisters would never find husbands. Everything I have sacrificed would be for nothing. There is a man, a good man, a kind man, who has asked me to marry him. His name is Thomas Whitmore, and he works as a groom at Thornfield Manor, the very estate where Richard now lives with his new bride. Thomas knows everything. I told him the truth, and he loves me still. He has offered to raise the child as his own, to give it his name and his protection, and in return I will be his wife, bound to the very land that holds my shame. I do not love him, Catherine, not the way I loved Richard, but I respect him and I trust him, and that will have to be enough. If I have a daughter, I will name her Clara. It means bright, clear, like light through glass. And perhaps she will be everything I was not. Perhaps she will find a way to live in this world without being broken by it. Forgive me for disappearing. Forgive me for not telling you sooner. And if you ever have the chance, if our paths ever cross again, please look after my child. Please make sure she knows that she was wanted, that she was loved, even when I could not say it. Your friend always, Margaret. I read the letter 3 times before the words finally sank in. My mother had been engaged to a Lord Blackwood. My mother had been seduced and abandoned by a man who later married another woman. My mother had carried a child that was not my father's, a child conceived in love and born in shame. I was that child. The realization hit me like a blow to the chest. I was not Thomas Whitmore's daughter by blood. I was the illegitimate child of a lord, born in secret and raised in obscurity, hidden from the world that would have destroyed my mother if the truth had ever come to light. And Lord Richard Blackwood. The name echoed in my mind, familiar and terrible. The old Duke, Edmund's father, had been named Richard. The old Duke who had died 3 years ago with his cold eyes and his stern demeanor. The man who had humiliated my mother and abandoned her to poverty. The man who had left her with nothing but a child and a broken heart. Edmund's father was my father. Edmund was my half-brother. I do not know how long I sat there in the darkness, the letter clutched in my trembling hands, the candle guttering and finally going out. The world had turned upside down. Everything I thought I knew about myself, about my place in this world, had been a lie. I was not a servant's daughter. I was a duke's daughter, born on the wrong side of the blanket, raised in ignorance of my own blood. And the man whose cruelty had shaped my life, whose cold words had haunted my dreams, was my brother. I was sick. I stumbled to the basin in the corner of my room and was violently ill, my body rebelling against the knowledge that my mind could not accept. When there was nothing left inside me, I collapsed onto my narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, trying to make sense of a world that no longer made sense. Sleep did not come. Dawn crept through my window, gray and cold, and I rose from my bed like a ghost, dressing mechanically, pinning my hair beneath my cap. I had duties to perform, floors to scrub, linens to wash. The world had not changed simply because my understanding of it had shattered. But as I moved through the corridors of Thornfield Manor, I saw everything differently. The portraits on the walls, the Blackwood ancestors with their cold eyes and their proud bearing. Were those my ancestors too? Did I carry their blood in my veins, the same blood that flowed through Edmund's? I thought of the way he had looked at me at the ball. The shock, the wonder, the strange fascination that had followed me everywhere since. Had he sensed something? Had some part of him recognized the kinship that neither of us had known existed? The thought made me ill again. I needed answers. I needed to understand. And there was only one person who could give me what I needed. I found Lady Ashworth's address in the society pages of an old newspaper that Mrs. Pemberton kept in her office. Ashworth Hall was 3 days' journey by public coach, an impossible distance for a servant with no money and no time. But I had to try. I had to know the truth, all of it, before I could decide what to do with this knowledge that was slowly burning me alive. It was my father who made it possible. Thomas Whitmore, the man who had raised me as his own, who had given me his name and his protection without ever revealing the secret he had carried for 22 years. I went to him in the stables, and I showed him the letter, and I watched his weathered face crumple with a grief he had hidden for decades. "I wondered when she would tell you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I always knew this day would come." "You knew," I said. "You knew all along, and you never said anything." He looked at me with eyes full of love and sorrow. "What would I have said, Clara? That your mother loved another man before me? That she carried his child and married me out of desperation? That the blood in your veins belongs to the very family we serve?" He shook his head. "She made me promise. When she died, when you were just a few hours old, she made me swear that I would never tell you. She wanted you to have a chance at a normal life, a life without the shadow of scandal hanging over you." "A normal life," I repeated bitterly. "A life of being called horse-faced and sent to the stables. A life of being humiliated by my own brother." Thomas flinched. "I did not know," he said. "About what he said to you. Mrs. Pemberton told me later. After the ball. If I had known, I would have." "You would have what?" I demanded. "Challenged the Duke to a duel? Demanded satisfaction for the honor of a servant girl?" I shook my head, all the anger draining out of me, leaving only exhaustion. "It does not matter. None of it matters. I just need to understand." Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch. He pressed it into my hands, and I felt the weight of coins inside. "Go to Lady Ashworth," he said. "She was your mother's closest friend. She will tell you what you need to know." And he paused, his eyes glistening. "Whatever you learn, whatever you decide to do with it, know that I love you, Clara. You are my daughter, regardless of blood. You have always been my daughter." I embraced him then. This man who had given me everything without ever asking for anything in return. And when I finally pulled away, I saw something in his face that I had not seen before. Pride. Not the cold, aristocratic pride of the Blackwoods, but something warmer, something real. "Go," he said. "Find your answers. And then come home." The journey to Ashworth Hall took 4 days. I traveled by public coach through rain and mud, sleeping in cramped inns and eating food that tasted like sawdust. I had never been so far from Thornfield Manor, never seen so much of the world beyond the moors. It should have been exhilarating. Instead, I felt only a growing dread, a sense that I was hurtling towards something I could not stop. Lady Ashworth received me in her private sitting room, a warm space filled with books and flowers and the soft glow of afternoon light. She did not seem surprised to see me. She simply gestured to the chair across from her and poured me a cup of tea as though we were old friends reuniting after a brief absence. "You have read the letter," she said. It was not a question. I have. And you have questions. I have so many questions that I do not know where to begin. Lady Ashworth smiled sadly. Then let me begin for you. She settled back in her chair, her eyes distant, remembering. Your mother was the most extraordinary woman I ever knew. She was beautiful, yes, but more than that, she was brave. She had a fire in her that society tried to extinguish, and she refused to let it die. When Lord Richard Blackwood courted her, I warned her that he was not to be trusted. I told her that men like him did not marry women like us, that they took what they wanted and discarded the rest. But she loved him. God help her, she loved him with her whole heart. What happened, I asked, after he broke the engagement? Lady Ashworth's face hardened. He married Lady Beatrice Ashford, a woman with a fortune and a family name. A suitable match, his parents called it. Margaret was forgotten, swept away like dust from a mantelpiece. She found work as a seamstress, supported her family as best she could. And then Richard came back. The letter mentioned that. Yes. He came to her in secret, swearing his love, promising a future that could never exist. And Margaret believed him because she wanted to believe, because the alternative was too painful to bear. Lady Ashworth's voice was bitter. By the time she realized the truth, it was too late. She was with child, and Richard had moved on to his next conquest. He never knew about you, Clara. Or if he did, he chose not to acknowledge it. I sat in silence, absorbing the weight of her words. My mother had been young and in love, betrayed by a man who saw her as nothing more than a plaything. It was a story as old as time, as common as rain. And yet it was my story, the origin of everything I was. Why did she marry my father? I asked. Thomas, I mean, if she did not love him? Lady Ashworth's expression softened. Thomas Whitmore was a good man. He had loved Margaret from afar for years, and when he saw her suffering, he offered her a way out. Marriage, respectability, a name for her child. He asked nothing in return except her companionship. She accepted because she had no other choice, and because she recognized the gift he was giving her. And in time, she came to care for him. Not with the passion she had felt for Richard, but with something quieter, something real. And me? I asked. What did she want for me? Lady Ashworth reached out and took my hand. She wanted you to be free, she said simply. Free from the constraints that bound her. Free from the judgment of a society that would have destroyed you if it knew the truth. She wanted you to live, Clara. To find happiness in whatever form it took. Tears were streaming down my face. I did not remember when they had started. And now, I whispered, what am I supposed to do now? Edmund is my brother. The man who humiliated me. The man who danced with me at the ball. He is my blood. Lady Ashworth was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that changed everything. He does not know. I stared at her. What? Edmund does not know about you? His father never told him. Never told anyone. The secret died with Richard Blackwood 3 years ago. As far as Edmund is aware, he is the only child of the Duke and Duchess of Thornfield. But the letter. You knew. My mother knew. Yes. But we were the only ones. And I kept the secret, Clara, because I did not know what else to do. I did not know if revealing the truth would help you or harm you. But now, she paused, studying my face with those keen eyes. Now I think you must decide for yourself. Decide what? Whether to tell him, whether to claim your birthright, whether to remain in the shadows or step into the light. Lady Ashworth squeezed my hand. You are the legitimate daughter of Lord Richard Blackwood, Clara. Not by law, but by blood. You have as much claim to the Blackwood name as Edmund does. What you do with that knowledge is your choice. I spent 3 more days at Ashworth Hall talking with Lady Ashworth, reading the letters my mother had written to her over the years. I learned about a woman I had never known, a woman of courage and passion who had been broken by a world that had no place for her dreams. And I learned about myself, about the blood that flowed through my veins, about the legacy that had been hidden from me since birth. When I finally returned to Thornfield Manor, I was not the same person who had left. I was Clara Whitmore, daughter of Thomas Whitmore, maid in the household of the Duke of Thornfield. But I was also Clara Blackwood, half-sister to the Duke, heir to a secret that could destroy us both. I did not know what I was going to do. I did not know if I would tell Edmund the truth or carry the secret to my grave as my mother had intended. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was done hiding. I was done being invisible. Whatever happened next, I would face it with my head held high, with the dignity that Lady Ashworth had seen in me, with the fire that my mother had passed down through her blood. The world had told me I was worthless, that I was ugly, that I belonged in the stables with the horses. The world had been wrong. It was time to show them what I was truly made of. The autumn came early that year, painting the moors in shades of gold and crimson, filling the air with the smell of wood smoke and decay. I returned to my duties at Thornfield Manor, but everything was different now. I moved through the corridors with a new awareness, seeing the house not as a place of servitude, but as a piece of my own history. These walls had sheltered my mother when she was young and in love. These halls had witnessed the betrayal that had shaped my entire life. Edmund noticed the change in me. I could see it in the way he watched me, the confusion in his storm-gray eyes, the hesitation in his step when our paths crossed. He no longer appeared in corridors simply to stare at me from a distance. Now he sought me out, finding excuses to speak to me, to ask my opinion on matters that had nothing to do with my work. "Tell me, Miss Whitmore," he said one afternoon, finding me in the library where I was dusting the shelves. "What do you think of this room?" I looked around at the towering shelves, the leather-bound volumes, the massive fireplace that dominated one wall. "I think it is a room that has seen many secrets," I said carefully. Edmund raised an eyebrow. An unusual answer. "You asked an unusual question." He was quiet for a moment, his eyes tracing the spines of the books as though searching for something he had lost. "My father spent most of his time in this room," he said finally. "When he was not traveling or attending to business, he would lock himself away here for hours. I used to wonder what he was doing, whether he was reading or thinking or simply hiding from the family he did not know how to love." "And what did you conclude?" I asked, my heart beating faster. Edmund's jaw tightened. "I concluded that he was a coward, that he surrounded himself with other people's words because he did not have the courage to speak his own." I set down my dusting cloth and turned to face him fully. "Perhaps he was afraid," I said. "Perhaps he had done things in his life that he was ashamed of, and the books were a way of escaping that shame." Edmund looked at me sharply. "You speak as though you knew him. I knew men like him." I kept my voice steady, though my pulse was racing. Men who build walls around themselves because the alternative is too painful. Men who hurt others because they do not know how to face their own wounds. "And women?" Edmund asked, his voice softening. "Do women do the same?" "Sometimes. But women are taught from birth that our pain is not important, that we must smile and endure and never let anyone see the cracks in our facade." I met his eyes, and I saw something there that surprised me. Vulnerability, raw and unguarded. So we learn to carry our wounds in silence, and eventually we forget that they are even there. Edmund took a step closer to me. "I did that to you," he said quietly. "When I called you what I called you, I added to the wounds you were already carrying. Yes, and yet you are still here. You have not fled. You have not demanded satisfaction or sought revenge. Why?" I considered the question carefully. "Because running away would not change what happened," I said finally. "Because revenge would not heal the wound, only deepen it. And because I believe that people can change, that the cruelty we inflict on others often comes from the cruelty we inflict on ourselves. She paused. Do you want to change, Your Grace? Edmund's eyes searched my face. I do not know, he admitted. I do not know if I am capable of it. Then perhaps that is where you should start, by figuring out what you are capable of, not what your father was, or what society expects you to be, but what you, Edmund Blackwood, are truly capable of becoming. I left him standing in the library, surrounded by his father's books and his father's secrets. And as I walked through the corridors of Thornfield Manor, I felt something shifting inside me. The anger was still there, the hurt, the years of humiliation and shame. But underneath it all, there was something else, a recognition that Edmund was as much a victim of his father's legacy as I was, that we were both children of a man who had never learned how to love. The question was whether we could learn together. Winter descended on the moors with a ferocity that took everyone by surprise. Snow fell for 3 days without stopping, piling in drifts against the walls of the manor, blocking the roads and trapping everyone inside. The great house became a world unto itself, cut off from the outside, forced to confront the tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface. I was assigned to help in the main house during the storm, my usual duties impossible with the laundry rooms frozen and the gardens buried under snow. It was the first time I had spent extended periods in the family's living quarters, and I found myself drawn into their world in ways I had not anticipated. Lady Rosalind had remained at Thornfield after her engagement ball, her wedding to the Earl of Westbrook planned for the spring. She was a kind woman, gentle and warm-hearted, and she took an immediate liking to me that I did not quite understand. You are the girl from the ball, she said when she first saw me carrying firewood into the drawing room, the one who made my brother drop his glass. Yes, my lady. She smiled, and there was mischief in it. He has not been the same since that night. I do not know what you said to him, but something changed. He is almost human now. I did not know how to respond to that, so I simply curtsied and continued with my work. But Lady Rosalind was not easily deterred. She sought me out over the following days, engaging me in conversation, asking about my life and my opinions and my dreams. She seemed genuinely interested in my answers, and I found myself opening up to her in ways I had not expected. One evening, as the storm raged outside and the candles flickered in their sconces, Lady Rosalind asked me to stay after I had finished my duties. Sit with me, she said, gesturing to the chair beside the fire. I am tired of my own company, and my brother has locked himself in the study again. I could use someone to talk to. I hesitated. It would not be proper, my lady. Proper, she repeated, and there was an edge to her voice. I am so tired of proper. Proper is what kept me from marrying the man I loved for 3 years because he did not have a title. Proper is what made my brother into a statue of ice because our father taught him that emotion was weakness. She looked at me with eyes that were suddenly fierce. Sometimes proper needs to be broken, Miss Whitmore. Sometimes it is the only way to breathe. I sat down. We talked for hours that night, as the fire burned low and the wind howled against the windows. Lady Rosalind told me about her childhood, about the parents who had been more concerned with appearances than affection, about the brother she had idolized and then feared as he retreated further and further into himself. And I told her about my own life, about the years of mockery and shame, about the night of the ball and everything that had happened since. But I did not tell her the truth about my parentage. That secret was too dangerous, too explosive to share with anyone, until I had decided what to do with it. It was nearly midnight when Edmund appeared in the doorway. He stopped when he saw me sitting by the fire with his sister, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, and something else I could not name. Brother, Lady Rosalind said, rising from her chair, come join us. Miss Whitmore has been keeping me company while you hide in your study. I should go, I said quickly, standing. No. Edmund's voice was quiet but firm. Stay, please. He crossed the room and took the chair across from us, his long legs stretched toward the fire, his eyes fixed on the flames. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence was heavy, charged with something I did not understand. "Rosalind," Edmund said finally, "would you give us a moment alone?" Lady Rosalind looked from her brother to me and back again, her eyebrows raised. "Of course," she said, though there was curiosity in her voice. "I will be in my chambers if you need me." When she was gone, Edmund finally looked at me. His eyes were dark in the firelight, shadows playing across his angular features. "There is something I need to tell you," he said. "Something I have been trying to say for weeks, but the words keep escaping me." My heart was pounding. I could feel the secret of my birth burning in my chest, demanding to be spoken. But I stayed silent, waiting. Edmund rose from his chair and began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back. "I have spent my entire life being told who I am supposed to be," he said. "The heir, the duke. The man who must carry on the family name, produce an heir of his own, maintain the honor that generations of Blackwoods have built. I was married at 25 to a woman I did not love, a woman who wasted away in a room at the end of the East Corridor, because I did not know how to reach her. She died thinking I hated her." He stopped pacing, his back to me. Perhaps I did. I do not know anymore. I did not speak. I sensed that he needed to say these things, that they had been building inside him for years, waiting for someone to hear them. "When I saw you at the ball," Edmund continued, his voice rough, "when you walked through those doors in that gown, with your head held high and your eyes blazing, I felt something I had not felt in years, curiosity, interest, a desire to know more about this woman who had been invisible to me for so long." He turned to face me, and there was anguish in his eyes, and then I remembered what I had said to you, what I had called you, and I understood that I had become exactly what my father was, a man who destroys beautiful things because he is afraid of them. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me. "You think I am beautiful?" The words escaped before I could stop them, small and vulnerable, and utterly unlike the strong woman I had been trying to be. Edmund crossed the room in 3 strides. He stopped in front of me, close enough that I could feel the heat of him, close enough that I could see the pulse beating in his throat. "I think you are the most beautiful woman I have ever seen," he said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "I think I have been blind and foolish and cruel, and I do not deserve your forgiveness, but I am asking for it anyway. I am asking for a chance to prove that I can be better than what I was." I looked up at him, this man who was my enemy and my brother, and something else entirely. The secret was there, on the tip of my tongue, ready to shatter everything. But I could not say it, not yet, not when he was looking at me like that, like I was the only real thing in a world full of shadows. "I need time," I said, "to think, to understand what this is." Edmund nodded slowly. "Take all the time you need. I am not going anywhere." He left me standing by the fire, my heart in turmoil, the secret burning hotter than ever. I knew I could not keep it forever. I knew that eventually the truth would have to come out, one way or another. But for now, for this one moment, I allowed myself to feel what I was feeling without judgment or fear. I was falling in love with my half-brother, and I had no idea how to stop. The storm broke on the 4th day, the clouds parting to reveal a world transformed by snow. The roads were cleared within a week, and the normal rhythms of life at Thornfield Manor slowly resumed. But nothing was normal for me. I moved through my days in a daze, performing my duties mechanically while my mind churned with impossible questions. I could not be in love with Edmund. The very thought was monstrous, a violation of every natural law. We shared blood, shared a father, shared a history that had been hidden from us both. If the truth came out, it would destroy us. It would destroy everyone. But love does not obey logic. Love does not care about blood or propriety or the judgment of society. Love simply is, and no amount of reasoning could make it go away. I tried to avoid him. I took on extra duties in the lower parts of the house, volunteered for tasks that kept me far from the family's living quarters. But Edmund seemed to sense my withdrawal, and he responded by seeking me out more persistently than ever. He appeared in the laundry room one afternoon, his fine clothes absurdly out of place among the tubs of soapy water and the steam rising from the irons. The other servants scattered at his approach, disappearing through doorways and behind screens, leaving me alone with him. "You are avoiding me," he said. It was not an accusation. It was a fact. I kept my eyes on the linen I was folding. "I have duties to attend to, Your Grace." "Edmund." He stepped closer, his voice soft. "When we are alone, I want you to call me Edmund. That would not be proper." "Damn what is proper." He reached out and took my hand, stilling my movements. "Clara, look at me." I looked, and I saw everything I was trying to deny. The longing, the confusion, the desperate hope that somehow, against all odds, this impossible thing between us could find a way to exist. "I know something is wrong," Edmund said. "I know there is something you are not telling me. I see it in your eyes, in the way you pull away from me. But whatever it is, I need you to know that it does not change how I feel. It does not change what I want." "And what do you want?" I asked, my voice trembling. "You," he said simply. "I want you, Clara, in whatever way you will have me." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. I felt tears pricking at my eyes, tears of grief and joy and terrible, impossible longing. I wanted to tell him the truth. I wanted to confess everything, to lay bare the secret that was tearing me apart. But I could not. Not here, not like this, not in a laundry room with steam rising around us like the mists of some purgatorial dream. "I need to show you something," I said finally. "But not here. Meet me in the library tonight, after everyone has gone to bed. There is something you must see." Edmund nodded, his eyes searching my face. "Whatever it is," he said, "we will face it together." I hoped he was right. I feared he was wrong. The library was dark when I arrived, lit only by the fire that had been kept burning through the night. Edmund was already there, standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit snow. He turned when he heard me enter, and I saw the tension in his shoulders, the worry in his eyes. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I crossed the room and held out the letter, the same letter that Lady Ashworth had given me the night of the ball. "Read this," I said. He took it from me, his brow furrowing with confusion. "What is this?" "The truth. About me. About us." I watched his face as he read. I watched the confusion give way to understanding, and then to shock, and then to something I could not name. He read the letter twice, 3 times, as though the words might change if he looked at them long enough. When he finally looked up, his face was pale as the snow outside the window. "This cannot be true," he said, his voice barely audible. "It is true. Your father and my mother. Before he married your mother, before I was born. I am his daughter, Edmund. I am your sister." The word hung in the air, ugly and undeniable. Sister, half-sister to be precise, but the distinction seemed meaningless in that moment. We shared blood. We shared a father. The feelings that had been growing between us were not just improper, they were forbidden, unnatural, wrong. Edmund staggered backward, catching himself on the edge of a chair. "No," he said. "No, this cannot be. My father would never have." "Your father did," I interrupted, my voice harder than I intended. "He seduced my mother and abandoned her. He left her with nothing but a child and a broken heart. And then he went on to live his life as though she had never existed." Edmund's hands were shaking. The letter trembled in his grip, the old paper threatening to tear. "I did not know," he said, and there was anguish in his voice. "I swear to you, Clara, I did not know. I know you did not. That is why I am telling you now. Because whatever this is between us, it cannot continue. We cannot be what we were starting to become." Edmund looked at me, and I saw the grief in his eyes, the same grief I had been carrying for weeks. It was the death of something that had never been born, the mourning of a future that could never exist. "I love you," he said, and the words were like a knife in my heart. "God help me, Clara, I love you." "I know," I whispered. "I love you too. And that is why we must stop. That is why we must never speak of this again." The silence that followed was the longest of my life. I watched Edmund struggle with the truth, watched him grasp for some argument, some loophole, some way to make the impossible possible. But there was none. The law of blood was absolute. The sin of incest was unforgivable. We were trapped by a legacy we had not created, prisoners of a secret that had been kept for 22 years. "What do we do now?" Edmund asked finally. "I do not know," I admitted. "But I think I must leave. I cannot stay here, knowing what I know, feeling what I feel. It is too much." "No." Edmund's voice was sharp. "No, you cannot leave." He crossed the room and took my hands in his grip almost painful. "There must be a way. There must be something we can do." "What? What could we possibly do?" "The truth is what it is, Edmund. We cannot change it. Then we will not tell anyone. We will keep the secret, as your mother kept it, as my father kept it. No one else needs to know." I stared at him. And what then? We live out our lives in the same house, loving each other in silence, never able to touch, never able to be what we want to be? That is not living, Edmund. That is torture. It is better than losing you entirely. The desperation in his voice broke something inside me. I had spent so long being strong, being resilient, carrying the weight of my secret without letting it crush me. But in that moment, standing in the library with the man I loved and could never have, I felt my strength fail me. I collapsed against him, my face pressed to his chest, my tears soaking through the fine wool of his jacket. We stayed that way for a long time, holding each other in the darkness, two broken people trying to find comfort in the midst of an impossible situation. And when the first light of dawn began to creep through the windows, we pulled apart and looked at each other with eyes that had cried themselves empty. "We will find a way," Edmund said. "I do not know how, but we will find a way." I refused to accept that this is the end. I wanted to believe him. God, how I wanted to believe him. But the weight of reality was too heavy, and hope felt like a luxury I could no longer afford. The weeks that followed were a special kind of torment. Edmund and I maintained a careful distance in public, never speaking more than necessary, never allowing our eyes to meet for longer than a moment. But in private, in the stolen hours of the night, we continued to meet in the library, talking until dawn about everything and nothing, building a relationship that existed in the shadows because it could not exist in the light. We did not touch. We could not allow ourselves that weakness. But the longing was there, constant and consuming, a fire that burned without fuel. It was during one of these late-night conversations that Edmund told me about his mother. She was a cold woman, he said, staring into the fire. Not cruel, like my father, but distant, unreachable. I used to wonder if she knew about my father's infidelities, if that was why she could never bring herself to love him. Or me. Did she ever speak of it? Once, shortly before she died. She took my hand and told me that there were things she had forgiven my father for and things she never could. She said that some sins leave stains that never wash out, no matter how much time passes. He paused. "I think now that she might have known about your mother, about you." The thought sent a chill down my spine. If she knew, why did she never say anything? Perhaps she thought it was better to keep the secret buried. Perhaps she thought that exposing the truth would only cause more pain. Edmund's jaw tightened. Or perhaps she simply did not care. My parents were not known for their compassion. I reached out, almost touching his hand before pulling back. We were trapped in this dance of almost, always reaching and never grasping, always wanting and never having. "What will we do, Edmund?" I asked, the question I had asked 100 times before. And as he had 100 times before, he answered, "I do not know. But we will think of something. We must." The answer came from an unexpected source. Lady Ashworth arrived at Thornfield Manor in late February, her carriage cutting through the last of the winter snow. She came ostensibly to visit Lady Rosalind and discuss the upcoming wedding, but I knew from the look in her eyes when she saw me that there was another purpose to her visit. "We need to speak," she said quietly, pulling me aside in the corridor. "Tonight, in the library. And bring Edmund." I did not know how she knew about our meetings in the library. I did not know how she had guessed that Edmund knew the truth. But Lady Ashworth had proven herself to be a woman of unusual perception, and I had learned to trust her instincts. That night, the three of us gathered in the library. Edmund stood by the fire, his expression guarded. Lady Ashworth sat in the chair nearest the window, her silver hair gleaming in the candlelight, and I stood between them, the bridge that connected their worlds. "I know what you are to each other," Lady Ashworth began without preamble. "I have known since the ball, the way you looked at each other, the tension between you. It was obvious to anyone who knew what to look for." She paused. "And I know what you are feeling now, the impossibility of it, the despair. I have come to offer you a way out." Edmund stepped forward. "A way out? What are you talking about?" Lady Ashworth smiled, but there was sadness in it. "When Margaret died," she said, addressing me, "I promised myself that I would look after you, that I would find a way to give you the life she had wanted for you. But I was weak. I was afraid. And so I let the years pass, telling myself that ignorance was a kind of protection." She shook her head. "I was wrong. I see that now. You deserve to know the truth, all of it. And that includes the truth about your father." I felt the blood drain from my face. "What do you mean?" Lady Ashworth reached into her reticule and pulled out another letter, this one yellowed and fragile with age. "This was written by your mother shortly before she died. She gave it to me for safekeeping, to be delivered to you only if certain conditions were met." She hesitated. "I should have given it to you long ago, but I was afraid of what it contained, afraid of the havoc it might wreak. Now I see that keeping it secret has only caused more pain." She handed me the letter, and I unfolded it with trembling hands. "My dearest Clara," it began. "If you are reading this, then Catherine has judged the time to be right. I pray that you will understand, and that you will find it in your heart to forgive me for the deception I have practiced your entire life. Lord Richard Blackwood is not your father. I know what I wrote in my earlier letter to Catherine, and at the time I believed it to be true. But several months after I married Thomas, I discovered something that changed everything. Richard Blackwood was not capable of fathering children. He had suffered an illness in his youth that left him sterile, a secret he kept from everyone, including his wife. When I learned this, I realized that the child I was carrying could not be his, and there was only one other possibility: Thomas. We had been intimate once, on the night before my wedding, a moment of weakness and desperate longing that I had convinced myself meant nothing. But that night was the night you were conceived, Clara. Thomas is your father, your true father, in blood as well as in name. I never told him. I never told anyone. I was too ashamed of what I had done, too afraid of what it would mean if the truth came out. And so I let everyone believe that you were Richard's child. Let the secret fester in silence. Let it shape your life in ways I never intended. I am so sorry, my darling. I am sorry for the lies, for the deception, for the burden I have placed on your shoulders. But I want you to know the truth now, whatever consequences it may bring. You are not a child of scandal. You are a child of love, conceived in a moment of genuine feeling between two people who cared for each other deeply. Thomas loves you. He has always loved you. And he is, in every way that matters, your father. Forgive me. Your mother, Margaret. I read the letter 3 times, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes were seeing. It was impossible. It was a trick, another layer of deception in a life that had been built on deception. And yet the handwriting was the same as the first letter. The paper was the same age. The ink faded to the same brown. There was no way Lady Ashworth could have forged this. No reason she would have. I looked up at Edmund, and I saw my own shock reflected in his eyes. He understood. He understood what this meant. "We are not related," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Edmund and I, we are not brother and sister." Lady Ashworth nodded. "You never were." Margaret believed it for a time, and so did I. But the truth is that Thomas Whitmore is your father, always has been. The relief that flooded through me was so intense that I thought I might faint. Edmund was at my side in an instant, his arm around my waist, steadying me. But we both knew what this meant. The obstacle that had stood between us, the impossible barrier of blood, had been an illusion all along. "Why?" I demanded, looking at Lady Ashworth. "Why did my mother lie?" "She did not lie," Lady Ashworth said gently. "She simply did not know the truth until later. And by then, she was dying. And the only way she could set things right was through this letter." She paused. "I should have given it to you sooner. I was afraid, as I said, afraid of what it might change. But when I saw you at the ball, when I saw the way Edmund looked at you, I realized that the time had come, that the secret had caused enough damage." I turned to Edmund, and I saw tears in his eyes. Tears of joy, of relief, of a hope that had been nearly extinguished, suddenly blazing back to life. "We are not related," he said, as though he needed to hear the words again. "We are not brother and sister." "No," I said, and I felt a smile spreading across my face, the first genuine smile I had felt in months. "We are not." What happened next was as inevitable as the sunrise. Edmund took my face in his hands and kissed me, right there in the library, in front of Lady Ashworth and God and anyone else who might be watching. And I kissed him back, pouring all the longing and despair and desperate hope of the past months into that single moment of connection. When we finally broke apart, Lady Ashworth was watching us with a satisfied smile. "I believe my work here is done," she said, rising from her chair. "But I would advise discretion, at least until you have figured out how to explain this to society. The daughter of a groom and a duke is scandal enough. The truth of your mother's history would only complicate matters." She left us alone in the library, the fire burning low, the dawn approaching. And Edmund and I spent the remaining hours of the night talking, planning, dreaming of a future that had seemed impossible just hours before. There would be obstacles, we knew. Society would not easily accept a match between a duke and a servant's daughter. Edmund's family, what remained of it, would object. The gossips would feast on the scandal for months, but none of that mattered. What mattered was that the insurmountable barrier had been removed. What mattered was that we were free to love each other without guilt, without shame, without the shadow of blood hanging over us. We would find a way. Together. The spring came early that year, melting the snow and filling the moors with wildflowers. Lady Rosalind married her earl in a ceremony that filled Thornfield Manor with music and laughter and joy. And as I watched her walk down the aisle, radiant in her white gown, I felt Edmund's hand slip into mine, hidden from view by the folds of my skirt. "Soon," he whispered. "Soon it will be our turn." I smiled and squeezed his hand. I know. The road ahead would not be easy, There were still secrets to untangle, truths to reveal, bridges to build between the world I had come from and the world I was entering. But for the first time in my life, I faced the future without fear. I was Clara Whitmore, daughter of Thomas and Margaret, beloved of Edmund Blackwood. I had been told I had the face of a horse, and for 22 years I had believed them. But I knew now that beauty was not about the shape of a face or the color of hair. Beauty was about courage. Beauty was about dignity. Beauty was about refusing to let the world define your worth. And when Edmund looked at me, he saw all of it. The pain, the strength, the resilience, the love. He saw the woman I had always been, hidden beneath the mask of a servant, waiting for someone brave enough to look. They said I had the face of a horse. But the night Edmund dropped his crystal glass, I understood that they had been wrong all along, and I never looked back. The months that followed were a delicate dance of revelation and reinvention. Edmund and I agreed that we would proceed carefully, revealing our relationship in stages rather than all at once. The first step was to elevate my position within the household, a move that would raise eyebrows, but not immediate scandal. Mrs. Pemberton, ever practical, accepted the change with equanimity when Edmund explained that I was to be transferred from my position as a general maid to a role as Lady Rosalind's personal attendant. It was a significant promotion, one that placed me in closer proximity to the family and gave me reason to appear at social functions in a capacity beyond mere service. Lady Rosalind herself was delighted by the arrangement. "I knew there was something between you," she confided one afternoon as I helped her dress for a luncheon. "Edmund has been a different man since the ball. Whatever you have done to him, I am grateful." I did not know how to respond, so I simply smiled and continued fastening the buttons at the back of her gown. The truth about my parentage remained a secret, known only to Edmund, Lady Ashworth, and myself. We agreed that there was no benefit to revealing the complicated history of my mother and Lord Richard Blackwood. The old Duke was dead, his sins buried with him, and exposing them would only cause pain to those who remained. What mattered was the truth that we knew, the truth that allowed us to love each other freely. Thomas, my father, accepted the changes with the quiet grace that had defined his entire life. When I told him what I had learned, when I showed him my mother's final letter, he wept. Not from sadness, but from relief. He had carried the secret of that night for over 2 decades, had wondered and hoped and feared in equal measure. To finally have the truth acknowledged, to know that his daughter was truly his, was a gift he had never expected to receive. "She loved you," I told him as we sat together in the small room above the stables where I had spent so many hours of my childhood. "In her own way, she loved you." Thomas nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his weathered hand. "I know," he said. "I always knew." That was enough for me. The announcement of our engagement came in the summer, timed to coincide with the height of the social season when all eyes would be on London and the gossip would have the farthest reach. Edmund wanted to confront the scandal head-on, to make our commitment public and undeniable, to dare society to object. I was terrified, but I had learned something in the months since the ball, something about courage and dignity and the power of refusing to be ashamed. I would not hide from the whispers. I would not flinch from the stares. I would walk into the lion's den with my head held high, and I would let them see the woman who had captured the heart of a duke. The reaction was everything we had expected, and more. The papers called it the scandal of the century, the love story of the decade, the most improbable match in living memory. They printed illustrations of my face alongside Edmund's, speculating about the nature of our relationship, the circumstances of our meeting, the secret history that must surely lie beneath the surface. They were not wrong about the secret history, of course, but the truth was stranger and more beautiful than anything they imagined. Lady Cordelia Vane, the woman who had once hoped to become Duchess of Thornfield, was particularly vicious in her condemnation. She spread rumors about my character, my history, my family. She whispered that I had seduced Edmund through witchcraft, that I had trapped him with lies, that I was nothing more than a scheming servant who had risen above her station. But for every enemy, we found an ally. Lady Ashworth defended me with the ferocity of a lioness, her social standing lending weight to her endorsement. Lady Rosalind became my fiercest advocate, championing my cause at every dinner party and ball. And slowly, gradually, the tide began to turn. The wedding took place in October, on a day when the moors were painted in shades of gold and crimson, and the air smelled of wood smoke and approaching winter. We were married in the chapel at Thornfield Manor, the same chapel where generations of Blackwoods had pledged their vows, the same chapel where Edmund's parents had been married in a union devoid of love or warmth. Ours would be different. Ours would be built on truth, on understanding, on the kind of love that transforms and redeems. I wore a gown of ivory silk, simpler than fashion, dictated but more beautiful for its restraint. My hair was unbound, falling past my shoulders in dark waves, adorned only with a circlet of wildflowers that Thomas had gathered from the moors at dawn. I wanted to look like myself on this day, not like a dressed-up doll playing a part. I wanted Edmund to see the woman he had fallen in love with, the woman with the long face and the strong jaw and the eyes that were too large for fashion. He was waiting for me at the altar, resplendent in his dark coat and silver waistcoat, his storm-gray eyes bright with emotion. As I walked toward him, I saw tears streaming down his cheeks, tears he made no effort to hide or wipe away. And I felt my own eyes grow wet, felt the joy rising in my chest like a symphony reaching its crescendo. Thomas gave me away, his hand trembling as he placed mine in Edmund's. The minister spoke the ancient words, words of commitment and fidelity, of love and honor. And when Edmund slipped the ring onto my finger, when he spoke his vows in a voice rough with feeling, I knew that everything I had endured, every moment of pain and shame and doubt, had been worth it. I was the Duchess of Thornfield, not because of my birth or my blood, but because of who I was, because Edmund had seen something in me that no one else had bothered to look for, and he had loved it into being. The years that followed were not without their challenges. Society never fully accepted me, never quite forgot the scandal of my origins. There were doors that remained closed to us, drawing rooms where we were not welcome, aristocratic circles that would never acknowledge the servant girl who had risen so far above her station. But we had each other. We had Thornfield Manor, a home that I transformed from a cold monument to the past into a warm sanctuary for the present. We had our children, 3 of them in time, 2 daughters and a son, each of them inheriting a piece of their father's intensity and their mother's resilience. And we had the truth about my mother and her heartbreak, the truth about Lord Richard and his cruelty, the truth about Thomas, my father, the good man who had given me his name and his love without ever asking for anything in return. The truth about ourselves, about the wounds we had carried and the ways we had learned to heal them together. Edmund never fully escaped the shadow of his childhood. There were days when the coldness returned, when he retreated into himself and could not find his way back. But I learned to reach him, to draw him out with patience and love, to remind him that he was not his father, that cruelty was not his destiny. And I never forgot where I came from. I never let the trappings of my new life erase the memories of the old. I continued to visit the stables, to sit with the horses and breathe in the familiar scent of hay and leather. I continued to treat the servants with the respect and kindness that I wished I had received in my years among them. And I made sure that my children knew the truth about their grandmother, the remarkable woman who had loved and lost and sacrificed everything for the chance of a better life. Years later, when Thomas passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 73, I was holding his hand. His last words were a whisper, barely audible. "Tell her I loved her. Tell Margaret that I never stopped. I will," I promised, tears streaming down my face. "I will tell her." And I like to think that wherever they are now, my mother and the man who truly loved her, they are together at last, free from the constraints of society, free from the secrets that bound them. Just two souls who found each other in a world that tried to keep them apart. It is a story I told my children as they grew, and that they have told their children in turn. The story of how their grandmother was loved, and how she loved in return. The story of how a horse-faced maid captured the heart of a duke, not through beauty or cunning, but through the simple, radical act of refusing to be anything other than herself. They said I had the face of a horse. For 22 years I believed them, but on the night Edmund Blackwood dropped his crystal glass at the sight of me, I understood the truth. Beauty is not about the shape of a face or the curve of a cheek. Beauty is about courage, about dignity, about standing tall in a world that wants you to shrink. I was beautiful all along. I just needed someone to help me see it. And when I did, nothing could ever make me feel small again.